Let's open the silent prayer. Lord in heaven, we ask for your blessing as we worship and study your word, the midnight cry message for us at this time. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So, happy Sabbath, everyone. Welcome to our Sabbath school. Last week we did a review of Elder Parminder's studies that he shared recently on the place of the Levites and our relationship with them. And I'd said that there's a study that I'm working on, which there is, but it's one of those things where the more you look at it, you realize that behind each door there are like 5 other doors that you need to look at. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So rather than share that, I want us to review the 2 presentations that he gave in October last year. The 2 presentations were, and I believe these were to the French ministry, but they were the first one was the executive branch must be one, and the second one was called the end of democracy is in sight. Right, and those 2 studies sort of they were a 2-part series that sort of built off on each other, highlighting particular developments in the United States, developments that are still underway at present and that we need to be paying attention to. As always, this is Sabbath school. It's not a lecture presentation. So I invite your thoughts, your input, your questions, whatever contribution you can make. Please don't hesitate to share. All right, so those 2 presentations given in October last year, right, and they're dealing with the Moore v. Harper case, which is currently at the Supreme Court. And this case has very important implications regarding the future of democracy in the United States. And of course, prophetically speaking, we have our eyes on the United States because, as the United States goes, so goes the world, as the saying goes, right? So, just this last week, we've observed, an attempted coup in Brazil. And that coup was after the mold of what took place on January 6th. In fact, there's been a whole lot of journalism already around the fact that what is going on, what happened, and what is going on in Brazil is presaged or modeled after Trump and what took place in the United States as far as the rejection of the last presidential election went. So, the end of democracy in the United States, in a very real sense, presages, the threats to democracy and the end of democracy in the rest of the world. So, a bit of context. So, externally, where do we stand? We currently stand in a pre-Sunday law history. I don't have my red marker. If I locate us, we are here. Blue will have to do. But I don't know why I don't speak person. I'm more with I. I'm going to give an I. So we stand in a pre-Sunday law history where the Sunday law issue for our dispensation is being agitated. right? We're in the agitation of the Sunday law, as has been presented, at least since last year. So what is it that's being agitated or shaken within the context of great controversy in the dispensation that it was written? The agitation is over the subject of Sabbath versus Sunday, that before the Sunday law is passed in earnest, there is this buildup where it is being agitated within the broader society. And people are largely brought to decisions in their thinking about their issue in that period of agitation prior to the actual Sunday law test itself. But we know now we're in a different dispensation. And as we observe what is taking place in society, what is it that is being agitated? What is it that we see as the issue? We see it being agitated at a social level, at a political level, at an economic level. It's the subversion of democracy, we could put it that way. The subversion of democracy, which is entrenching oppression, specifically patriarchal, an oppression which is characterized by its patriarchal nature, right? We're witnessing the subversion of democracy. So Aldo Parminder shared a study a few years ago on inspiration, how we view inspiration, and the degrees. I think it was, we say degrees of inspiration, right? And the conclusion of that study is that there are really two types of prophets in operation at this time in our dispensation. The first type is us, right? The stone of Daniel 2, the 144,000, right? This movement. The second group of prophets are the journalists in the world, those who present the news, right? The events that are happening in front of them. And as we observe what is going on in the world, we see this subversion of democracy, you know, the subversion of equality. And we are agitating these subjects within the movement, but the agitation in the public sphere is done principally by the other type of prophet. It's done by the journalists. And it is from this vantage point that we consider the events happening in the world, and more specifically, this Moore v. Harper case, which is currently before the Supreme Court, right? So Aldo Parminder shared an article from The Guardian, and this article is called "The Most Terrifying Case of All is About to Be Heard by the US Supreme Court," right? It was published on October 6th last year, right, by Stephen Donziger. He's a human rights lawyer and an environmental justice advocate. And you don't find a lot of information on this case. You're not likely to, you know, it's not front page news, shall we say, right? You kind of have to be engaged with the media sources that you are that you follow to find information about it, because, you know, even right now, I'd say the average person, it's not really on their radar. But some political scientists, you know, and even legal professors have said this case is the most consequential case, arguably the most consequential case for the future of American democracy, certainly in our lifetimes. You know, that's how important it is in the eyes of some. Right, but before we go into that article, which we will read together, which he shared, and we will review together, because it encapsulates the issue so well and its broader implications, right? I'll just share some context setting points about the American government. Okay, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So when we look at the understanding of how the Sunday law comes to pass, right, of course, broadly speaking, it's something that is brought about by an action of the government. And some of us have held the perspective, as do, I think maybe many Adventists, many of the Adventists who are minded to consider this subject, because many are not even minded to consider the issue of the Sunday law at this point. But many Adventists would say, it is not necessarily the executive branch that needs to be one. It doesn't really, the executive doesn't really matter for the Sunday law to pass. And this idea is based on Ellen White's quote from Great Controversy, page 442. Great Controversy, page 442. And here she says, speaking of the lamb-like beast, within the context of the build-up and eventual passing of the Sunday law, she says, the lamb-like horns and dragon voice of the symbol point to a striking contradiction between the professions and the practice of the nation thus represented. The speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. By such action, it will give the lie to those liberal and peaceful principles which it has put forth as the foundation of its policy. The prediction that it will speak as a dragon and exercise all the power of the first beast plainly foretell a development of the spirit of intolerance and persecution that was manifested by the nations represented by the dragon and the leopard-like beast. So the statement goes on, but this passage highlights, says the speaking of a nation, right? To speak as a dragon. The speaking of a nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. Right? And when you look at the United States, its government has three branches, as do the governments of many nations, right? There's a legislature, there's a judiciary, and there is the office of the president, right? And in this passage, she specifically highlights the legislative and judicial authorities, right, as representing the speaking of the dragon. So some have deduced from this that, well, the executive is not as important in the grand scheme of things when it comes to the Sunday law. It's not the presidency we should be paying attention to. We should be paying attention to the legislature and what is coming out of the judiciary. But yes, we should be paying attention to what the legislature and the judiciary are doing. But why is this narrow perspective wrong? Right? Let me ask that question to bring you in and engage you. Why is that narrow perspective incorrect? Will anyone venture a thought?
The executive branch still has to pass off on any bills that are put forth by the legislative branch. And consequently, the executive branch, primarily the president, still has a lot of power, and especially when you consider executive orders and different other aspects. It's not solely the body putting together the laws, but also those laws or those bills have to be put into law, which involves the executive branch.
Well, that is true practically speaking, but then what do you do with the Spirit of Prophecy passage? Any thoughts on that?
Well, legislative always indicates lawmaking, but it's the whole process of the lawmaking, and it's a simple way of equating it only to the legislative branch, but it is more complex than. For example, a lot of laws do not ever see the light of day.
I hear you, that's true. My Bluetooth speaker was beeping. I don't know what that meant, but it stopped, so I'm assuming everything's good. Okay, I understand. Okay, maybe that is a way to reconcile the practical reality with what is presented in the Spirit of Prophecy. But for one, I think we're guilty, at least those who held this perspective on the basis of this passage are guilty of eisegesis to a point. The eisegesis is basically theological speak for interpreting a text in such a way as to introduce your own presuppositions, agendas, or biases. It's reading into the text. So she does not mention the executive in this particular passage. It does not then follow, right? It's a further step outside what this passage is communicating to then say, well, because it's not mentioned within the context of this particular passage, it means it must not figure in the particular issue that is being highlighted by the passage. I think that's reading into the passage more than it is saying. Yeah. So Ellen White chose not to mention the branch, the executive branch, because it does not serve the point she was making. But that does not mean the executive branch is not important, right? So on one hand, there is this perspective on the basis of this passage, and maybe other passages like it, but I think this one primarily would suggest that the executive branch is not as pivotal a player in the march toward an eventual passing of a Sunday law. But then we also have the last president study, right, which was shared very widely in the closing years of the previous dispensation. Now, that study was hobbled by poor methodology, right? So it was wrong in a lot of its conclusions, but its fundamental premise was correct. It was correct in its emphasis of the importance of the executive branch, right? And so, practically speaking, right, what you were building off what you're saying, Debbie, the executive branch is important because without Republicans, we know that Republicans will be responsible for passing the Sunday law, because without winning the executive branch, the only other way to present that sort of legislation of that nature in a way that it will go through without being struck down is to have a supermajority, right? So as it stands in the United States, you can have an executive controlled by one party with both houses of the House. You could have one house controlled by one party, the other house by the other party, right? So even if you have Republicans controlling the legislature, if the president is a Democrat, the the executive can strike down that legislation. But a supermajority is needed for the legislature to pass laws that the executive, assuming that the executive is occupied by a Democrat, that the executive cannot overrule. And this is extremely difficult to accomplish and rare, right? So on the point of the supermajority, again, fleshing out this contextual piece about the US government and how it works, leading into our consideration of Harper v. Moore. It is the work of the House of Representatives, right? It is the work of the legislature to write laws. The House of Representatives, okay, to write laws, and if these laws are voted, if a given law is voted to pass with a simple majority in this case is 51%, that law is sent to the Senate for review and oversight. And at the Senate, if the Senate passes it again with a simple majority of 51%, that bill becomes law, right? That law is passed. But there is a second check in this process. The executive branch is that check. The executive branch has to accept and agree with that law, and that law only becomes the law of the land when the president signs off on it. If the president rejects a given law, even though it went through the House and the Senate, that law dies, right? So, as I've already stated, the way for Congress, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate jointly, the way for Congress to exercise its will against the president is through the supermajority clause. If each of the arms of Congress have a supermajority, they can override the president, right? However, gaining a supermajority in both houses is very difficult. The threshold, what constitutes a supermajority is 67%. It's more than a simple majority, right? It's 67% in both houses. Right? And this is very difficult to obtain. In fact, the last time this happened was 56 years ago now, right? So it's not in the lifetime of this movement. And over the last 200 years, there've only been 7 supermajorities, right? Through the history of the United States. So given this difficulty, the Republicans need to take the executive if they will pass a Sunday law. And the Moore v. Harper case this is where the Moore v. Harper case enters the stage, right, as a vehicle that could facilitate this for the Republicans. Okay.
Tabo?
So, yes?
I just wanted to say that there are, I think, examples in the past that show us how the executive is important. I don't know if you can hear me well because I'm sick. If you look at people like Gaddafi, Mussolini, or even Putin, all those people, those presidents, they had obviously the executive branch. And they were actors of the fall of democracy. So having this this position really helped, in a sense, for them, to pass those laws and to bring about an authoritarian government, and therefore a fall of democracy. I find that we can see, those similarities, and that shows how the executive is important for Republicans, to have, because if you, for example, you look at Putin, you can see how he's able, to pass whatever he wants. So he's the face of that country, he's the face of that government, and whatever needs to pass, that are in alliance with his belief, is able to go through. So yeah, that was just the point that I wanted to make, that there is, that similarity in having that executive branch, or the presidency, if we look at other countries, and the fact that we can see that fall of democracy, we can see that rise of authority. I can't say the word authoritism, I guess.
Authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I think comparatively speaking, right, we know, well, within the US context, the way their government structures are framed, they're designed, to really serve as checks and balances on one another, right? Which is why the Republicans, cannot, was why they're, even though they've taken even though they may control the legislature, they still need to take control of the executive, because the executive can otherwise, veto or put a stop to what it is that they want to do. But we do see that parallel across the world, that when you look at parts of the world where democracy is in retreat, right, where authoritarianism has become entrenched, was entrenching itself, you do see the prominence of the executive, and its role in bringing that about, right? Its role in bringing that about, and its role in perpetuating that, allowing it to continue. I think of, Zimbabwe, for example. Of course, we have examples all over the world, and the examples that we should understand and be familiar with and know what's going on, from India with Narendra Modi to Hungary with Viktor Orban, with Putin's Russia, but also think of Zimbabwe, for example. There are uncanny parallels between the Republican Party in the United States and the current ruling party in Zimbabwe right now. It's an interesting study of, if you see the methods being employed, if you see the parallels, the manipulation and undermining of electoral processes, right? The rolling back of voters' rights, the hyper partisanship of those in the legislature, right? And the role of the executive. There are all these parallels. It's almost like there's a roadmap for how democracies fall, right? And these countries all tend to follow the same trajectory. But yeah, so I guess just to add to your point, Kati, yes, it is useful to observe and compare, what we see happening in the United States with what we see happening in other parts of the world.
Extremism as well, because the hyper-partisanism that you mentioned, Bo, in a sense, it's further right, further left, further right, further left. They go to I'll use that word, hyper, go to hyper extremes, in a sense, moving further right or further left. And they sort of in a sense, can play off each other, like the extreme right, whether it be in a Hungary or in a Brazil or in Italy or Libya, wherever. In a sense, the backlash from that, or helping to promote a rise on the left, and then sometimes the left goes more left, more socialist, more further, and that of course works. More people in the centrist position move further right, or so it's sort of this. It's like a thundercloud building a little bit. The cloud will just cumulonimbus. It just expands on itself, and authoritarianism is that way. The more oppressive a regime becomes, in a sense, it produces that other reaction, and so on it goes. And of course, in the middle is God's way, and the information this movement is recognizing, the wrongs on the right, but also not being taken in by the wrongs that are on the left either.
Yes, thank you for that, Debbie. Yeah, so I guess building on from that, I'd like us to look at this article in The Guardian. Trying to think, should I share the actual article or just share my screen? I'll share my screen, and again, it lays out this point so well. Alder Parminder likened that, the journalists are the prophets, in tandem with us. Journalists are prophets, sort of prophesying to the world about the Sunday law. But of course, where they have a hammer, shall we say, we have a scalpel, right? In our understanding of things, it's through Bible prophecy, we're able to come to clearer understandings, and a better understanding of the bigger picture of all of this than they are. But it is always good to come across pieces like this that are able to articulate the issues, with such clarity for people, for people in the world, right? So I'll share my screen. Okay, so the article is called The most terrifying case of all is about to be heard by the US Supreme Court. And the subheading is, if the court upholds the rogue independent state legislature theory, it would put the US squarely on the path to authoritarianism, right? And to the extent that, the people around us are just carrying on their lives, to varying degrees of obliviousness of the seriousness of the movements that are happening under their nose, sharing articles like this with them and engaging them. At the very least, so they are aware, right? I think that's an important thing to do. Right, so it reads, it is well known that intense competition between democracy, authoritarianism, and fascism is playing out across the globe in a variety of ways, including in the United States. This year's US Supreme Court term, last year now, which started this week, is a vivid illustration of how the situation is actually worse than most people understood. A supermajority of 6 unelected ultra-conservative justices, 3 of whom were put on the bench by a president who did not win the popular vote, have aggressively grabbed yet another batch of cases that will allow them to move American law to the extreme right, and threaten US democracy in the process. The leading example of this disturbing shift is a little-known case called Moore v. Harper. I think I've been saying Harper v. Moore. Sorry about that. Which could lock in right-wing control of the United States for generations. The heart of the Moore case is a formerly fringe legal notion called the independent state legislature theory. This theory posits that an obscure provision in the US Constitution allowing state legislatures to set time, place, and manner rules for federal elections should not be subject to judicial oversight. In other words, state legislators should have the absolute power to determine how federal elections are run without court interference. Right, so there's this independent state legislature theory, which is at the heart of this Moore v. Harper case, right? And it basically, it would give, if approved by the court, right, by this hyper-partisan Supreme Court, right, which has conservative judges stacked in it, right, by Trump, and they're eager to receive this case as well as certain other cases, but they're eager to receive this case because the indication is that they are that they approve or will approve the independent state legislature concept, right? This theory would give state legislatures unchecked power over how federal elections are run. Right, and this would effectively rob state courts of the ability to protect voters' rights. Right, how so? So now the author goes into an example from the last election. I'll just read this paragraph. And then I'll share another example from just a couple of weeks ago, actually. So it says, think about this theory in the context of the last US election. After Joseph Biden defeated Donald Trump resoundingly in both the popular vote and in the Electoral College, Trump tried to organize a massive intimidation campaign to steal the election, which played out in the storming of the Capitol building on the 6th of January. But behind the scenes, the legal core of this attempt was to convince the many Republican-controlled state legislatures, which were 30 out of 50 states, to send slates of fake Trump electors from states like Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan, where Trump actually lost the popular vote. If Trump had succeeded, he would have won the election via the Electoral College, which is itself an anti-democratic relic, according to the author. And he would have been able to stay in office another term. If the Supreme Court buys the theory in the Moore case, this could easily happen in 2024 and beyond. In fact, it is possible Republicans will never lose another election again if this theory is adopted as law. Or put another way, whether Republicans win or lose, elections by the popular vote will not matter, because they will be able to maintain power regardless, right? So an important I'll read the next paragraph and comment. The next paragraph says, that's not democracy, and it would put the United States squarely in the same category as authoritarian countries with illiberal leaders like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and Russia. Each of the leaders of those countries ostensibly won, quote unquote, elections that were structurally rigged to virtually guarantee that they could not lose, right? So an important check, right, on the, what should I say, on Trump's, an important check on the Republicans' ability to do things like what Trump tried to do, to just send in fake electors, for example, just do things as they choose to do as a state legislature, right? An important check on that is the judiciary, right? The state courts, the state courts, but according to this independent state legislature theory, sorry, yeah? Is that Trevor? Trevor, do you say something? While your mic is open and we can hear you a little. There we go. Okay. So what this theory would do is that it would absolve the state legislatures of accountability to the courts. They can do what they want without the court's interference, right? And where you have state legislatures that are, for example, stacked with Republicans, many of them who are there through gerrymandering, right? Gerrymandering is something that is covered later in the same article. Then, they can just refuse to recognize an election that they've lost, right? As what Trump tried to do. And this is something that you see in all the countries where authoritarianism is rising or is entrenched, is that the electoral processes are rigged to virtually guarantee that the authoritarians cannot lose. Now, last month there was a case that I want to highlight. We know that with the midterm elections happened last year. Now, in the state of Arizona, there was a gubernatorial election at the same time as the midterm elections, and they were electing the state governor as well as conducting the midterm elections, right? And in that gubernatorial election, you have Katie Hobbs, who was the Democratic candidate, and you have Carrie Lake, who was a Trump-backed Republican candidate. In fact, you may have, I guess, Carrie Lake was prominently in the news during the course of that race for she's problematic in many ways. She's a Trump clone, essentially. She parallels him in rhetoric and yeah. So Katie Hobbs won. And Carrie Lake lost. She initially refused to concede. But when it comes to the midterm elections that happened concurrently, it was not guaranteed that the midterm elections were going to meet the deadline for verification. That deadline for verification was last month. And the reason why it was not guaranteed they would meet that deadline was because Cochise County in Arizona, the three-person board of supervisors over the election in that county voted on party lines 2-1 to not certify the election results. So it was a three-person board, one Democrat, 2 Republicans, and the Republican candidates decided not to certify the election result because the result happens, the votes are counted, and then it has to be certified. And their refusal to certify the vote put more than 47,000 votes at risk of not being counted in the state's total. And these 2 Republicans did not bring any proof of fraud, but they cited conspiracy theories that the machines to tabulate the results were not properly certified. But state and federal officials say that, that the machines were properly certified. So they had no proof beyond their assertion. They had no proof beyond conspiracy, essentially, for taking the action that they did. So the Katie Hobbs, who was the governor-elect at that point, she filed a lawsuit saying that the board was required by law to certify the election. right? And the state judge agreed, right, that the law is very clear. 3 days after the legal deadline for the certification of the results, this was beginning of December, an Arizona state judge ordered the board to certify the results by the end of that day. And they had to do so. One of them, absented themselves from the meeting to do so. So it ended up being just one Republican and one Democrat who signed off to certify the election as per the court order. Now, and of which that Republican, said, she said, she does not regret a thing about what she did. Right? It's trying to subvert democracy, trying to subvert the will of the people because it goes against your party or your ideology case, and says, she does not regret what she did. So the system held, and the votes were counted because the court intervened, right? Now, with this independent state legislature concept, right, which is before the Supreme Court now, picture this scenario with the court having no sanction or legal ground to intervene, right? It makes it essentially turns the electoral process into a fraud, right? Because whatever results don't go against the rising authoritarians, they will just refuse to certify, decertify, no evidence whatsoever. It's strictly ideological, strictly operating on ideological lines without any reference to truth or fact, right? Of course, we can look at January 6th, but there's this case from just last month where the checks and balances and the court being able to intervene, in the legislature, where it essentially saved democracy within those instances. And without this check, only nightmare scenarios emerge about what the future looks like, particularly with the current slate of, with the Republican Party as it is right now. Okay, so I'll continue with the article if no one has any thoughts to add.
Just a comment to Bo. The framers of the American Constitution intended that the three branches of government were equal and that there were checks and balances in place so that no one branch would supplant the roles or the power contained in the other two branches. And this is this tension and this that allows democracy to function. And in our dispensation, we've been seeing this whittling away of powers and a lot of behind the scenes kind of things happening to destroy voter rights and just all sorts of different things taking place. And this is this back and forth jockeying that, although unperceived by the majority of the public and even the church within Adventism, it is the reality of what's going on as we are progressing to the Sunday law. And these are the warning signs. We've got these different examples, and watching some of the things unfolding with election, midterm, and the events and so on that are happening. And it's God's mercy that is allowing all of these things to come into the forefront now to educate not only us, but others in the, I'll say in the world, but in the general public and so on, so that they can begin to perceive what's going on. And this is where the journalist prophets, who have been warning that democracy's on the line for quite a while now. In this court case, of course, is going to help reveal that, play it out further. Anyway, that was the comment I just wanted.
Amen. Thank you for that. If no one has any additional thoughts, I'll just continue with the article. It's a really fearful scenario if you picture January 6th, right? Or maybe not January 6th per se, but the lead up to January 6th, where Trump was attempting to just send fake electors, right, who would rubber stamp his victory even though he lost the election, right? No two ways. That could be 2024, or rather, right? If that happened, the next presidential election is next year, 2024, and picture all of that happening without the Supreme Court's ability to sort of interject and intervene, and him just getting away with it, right? That's exactly what happened. Yes?
Well, sorry to bore you, I was wanting to interrupt. There's a bit of a time gap. No, I was just going to speak to that. It's a thermometer. I mean, something like a conversation with the Georgia Secretary of State, who certifies the election results. Just find me 11,000 more votes. It's simple.
Mm-hmm.
Just find me 11,000 more votes. You think of something like that conversation coming out into the media, like even 10 years ago. But we could take it further back than that. And here it is that a lot of people didn't see any problem with that. Now, I mean, obviously some people did for obvious reasons, but that's the thermometer of
mm-hmm.
where we're at.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, right? It's been a long time coming. Right? It did not happen overnight. We know that. So, continuing on, the article says, it is disturbing that the Supreme Court used its increasingly diminished credibility with the public to take on a case that has no real purpose other than what I'm describing in this column. In the United States, our highest court only rules on approximately 70 cases a year out of the 7,000 petitions for review that are presented. It is a relatively lazy court. In contrast, the Supreme Court of Brazil rules on approximately 100,000 cases a year. If the US court agreed to accept the Moore case for review, it almost certainly plans to endorse this rogue ISL theory that could blow up elections and democracy in the United States as we know it. Context is important. This situation did not just come out of nowhere, but really is the product of a multi-decade strategy by a coalition of corporations and right-wing religious fundamentalists dating back decades to take control of the US government. Recent US history shows how spectacularly effective right-wing funders representing wealthy Americans and corporations have been in essentially buying control over our political system. These forces correctly perceive that if democracy is allowed to exist in an unfettered and neutral way, then corporate profits will be diminished and the powerful fossil fuel industry will be phased out over time. So they are organizing to prevent that from happening. This right-wing funding network simply could not exist with the enormous power that it has accumulated without the US Supreme Court's Citizens United case, which laid the groundwork for the current takeover of the Supreme Court. One industrialist just turned over his entire 1.6 billion fortune to an organization controlled by Leonard Leo, the brilliant mastermind behind the pro-corporate Federalist Society, which essentially put all six of the ultra-conservatives on the court. Right. So I guess a bit about right. He talks about how this has been this present development, right, is not something that's happened. It's not a recent thing. It's a part of a multi-decade strategy that has been planned and executed, right? And it highlights some of the key actors. Now, there are a couple of titles that I want to share with you. I'll go get them if you just allow me to pause for a moment. So a lot of the history that this author has just summarized in really 2 paragraphs is covered in, well, there's this title, One Nation Under God, right? How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And it highlights the history of this marrying of conservatives and corporates, right? Along with evangelicals, right? This current marrying that we see, right? In the Republican Party, right? And how it came about and how it is played out. Then there's this one, ideas with consequences, right? And it says ideas with consequences, the Federalist Society and the conservative counter-revolution. And we've spoken much about the Federalist Society, right? It is above any other organization, the organization responsible for the present circumstance in the Supreme Court, where we have these, some hyper-conservative judges. All of them came through the Federalist Society. And that, I guess the history of that is useful to know and understand, right? All right, this article highlights Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo was the long-term president of the Federalist Society. Maybe I think one of the founding members, right? And the long-time president of the Federalist Society. He's the mastermind behind it. And he recently received a $1.6 billion grant to continue his work in sort of forwarding this two-pronged strategy, right? It's a two-pronged strategy. On one hand, they're the political actions that they're taking, right, towards forwarding the priorities of the conservatives and the Republican Party. But then there's the legal prong as well, and that has been accomplished through their efforts to take control of the Supreme Court through the Federal Society, which they have accomplished. So he's sitting on, over $1 billion that he's using to continue this two-part assault on democracy, that he's played a historic role, right? I think when you look at the role he's played, it's although he's not one of the names that comes up, he's played a very, a historic role in bringing us to where we are at present. So the article goes on and says, should the court endorse the ISL theory, Republican-controlled legislators, sorry, I'll share my screen. Should the court endorse the ISL theory, Republican-controlled legislatures also will be able to gerrymander political districts to lock in permanent control of federal elections without judicial oversight. Gerrymandering is a fancy term to describe another method of voter suppression in the United States, setting district maps to guarantee that progressive or minority candidates simply cannot get elected except in pre-approved districts. It explains, for example, why in the state of North Carolina, Republicans control 8 of 13 seats in the US House of Representatives, despite the Democratic Party winning well over 50% of the statewide vote in the last several elections. The Moore case would, in practice, strip people of the right to fair elections by placing electoral power in the hands of a small group of officials at the state level who set district maps. In a presidential election, these officials could determine what slate of electors gets put forth to the Electoral College, regardless of the outcome of the state's popular vote. In the gerrymandered map at the heart of the Moore case, an evenly divided popular vote in North Carolina would have awarded 10 of the state's 14 seats in the House of Representatives to the Republicans, right? So at the heart of the Moore case is an electoral map that the Republicans were proposing and wanted to pass, right? But this electoral map was so gerrymandered, was so manipulated in favor of the Republicans that they were taken to court, and the state court ruled against that, that they can't, that they can't use that partisan electoral map that they wanted to use. And of course, now it's gone to the Supreme Court, right, which is stacked conservative. But I got this from Vox. This map is not in this article. I got this separately from Vox, but it is a map of what the shall we say the seat allocation, right, or what the in the state would have looked like, right? The state split 50-50. Sorry, what did this article say? It says, in the state of North Carolina, Republicans control 8 of 13 seats in the US House of Representatives, despite the Democratic Party winning over 50% of the statewide vote in the last election. And it says, in the gerrymandered map, at the heart of the Moore case, an evenly divided popular vote. So with an evenly divided popular vote in North Carolina, it would have awarded 10 of the state's 14 seats in the House to representatives of the Republican Party, right? So here it looks like a red wave. The Republicans essentially control the entire state. But with the map they proposed, this would have been the outcome with a 50-50 vote split, right? So the Republicans are gerrymandering the maps, the maps in the legislatures they control, and they are manipulating them such that it stacks in their favor, right? Because they know increasingly that they cannot win elections democratically. There are a whole lot of factors that are working against them. So authoritarianism and subverting the democratic process becomes the resort.
It should be noted that every 10 years, the boundaries are redrawn, and both parties, Republican and Democrat, practice gerrymandering. But at the same time, the inequity of redrawing lines of districts, voting districts, whereby the majority gets erased, gets it negated just because of the way the boundaries are drawn, whereby for the number of seats, the majority of, I'll just say, people of color voters, they get added into a different district, and therefore it waters down their vote. And that's sort of how the gerrymandering tips the scale, where a preponderance of, in this case of North Carolina, the Republican power will exist, when in reality, and as the article said, 50% of the voters are Democratic. But here the Republicans in the federal House of Representatives hold 8 of the seats in a state that purportedly could have far more Democratic representation. But that's what gerrymandering does. It skews the results. And this independent state legislature theory just will blow that wide open if it takes away from the courts any power to counter those drawn up maps, as in the case of North Carolina. It was a bit of a pilot project, or an example, I'll just use the word example, of what can happen if courts can't intervene and overrule. That's exactly what's going to happen. And that's what the point the article is making: Republicans being able to stay in power just indefinitely, because they're going to be skewing everything and tipping the balance unethically, really. But thanks. It's a good map.
So finishing the article off, the last paragraph says, while many are focused on the January 6th proceedings, the real coup has been going on quietly in the Supreme Court without a single shot being fired, as the judicial branch is set to deliberate a case that could drastically weaken the other branches of government. Never has it been more clear that it is time to rein in the power of our least democratic institution. Right. So that's the article. So this article is important because besides the fall of the king of the South, right, which we know precedes the rise, which we know precedes Daniel 11 verse 41, we have another line of prophecy, which is showing us that democracy in the United States is ending, right? Which must happen to make Daniel 11 verse 41 possible, right? So again, the points we made, this is decades in the making. It is the finishing touches that are happening now, and there won't be a change in direction. Right, so an important part of this puzzle that needs to be put in place is that the executive branch, really must be won by the Republicans. And this is on account of the fact of how difficult it is to win a supermajority. They've won the judiciary already, but they need the executives. And through this Moore v. Harper case, right, the groundwork is being paved for them to essentially entrench minority rule, right? Rule contrary to the will of the voting public, authoritarianism, essentially. So I think that concludes my review of, or rather, it's not so much a review because there's so much other things that he touched on in those two studies. It's more so just aspects of those two studies that I've pulled out. His two presentations, the executive branch must be won, and the end of democracy is in sight, from October last year by Elder Parminder. I'll encourage everyone to read that article again. You know, if you had forgotten about it, share it. And, you know, there's a bit more material online about this case, right? I believe oral arguments were on December 6th or 7th, right? But we should be following what's happening with it. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions before we close? No? Okay, so I will close with the word of prayer. Let's pray. Lord in heaven, we thank you for the messages that you are giving us. We thank you for the light which is giving us clear sight, clear perspective of where we are on the path. Lord, we are marching towards the Sunday law. We're marching towards the grand crisis of this time, for the time for which we were all born. Help us now to be living our lives daily with an eye towards glorifying your name in that time. But we must do that by glorifying your name each day now. Please bless us here in Canada. Lord, we are a small flock, but may you be with us. Please be with our families. Please be with each of us and help us to be the lights that you need us to be within our respective spheres of influence. We thank you for the Sabbath. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.